Once again, welcome back. We're going to go ahead and get started with step 2, which is the adaptive, healthy coping responses. And this is by far the most essential step in the 7-step panacea because it helps us confront the issue versus going in circles around the problem. And you may be familiar with the cow or buffalo analogy. And if you aren't, we're going to go over this together. So cows try to avoid the storm, simply prolonging their time in the storm by running with it, maximizing the pain, time, and effort to avoid it. And on the other hand, buffalo will charge toward the storm, spending a shorter duration of time in the storm without prolonging their torment. So as we all know, we have to address both the fear that's holding us back, which will also enable us to move forward on our path with a solid trajectory. And by being present today, you have all made the commitment, being willing to confront any blind spots or poor programming to ensure you will see your goals all the way through to fruition instead of prolonging the pain or the issue to achieve your ideal results. So congratulations to all of you. And however, we all know that happiness is an inside job. So if we are seeking external happiness to fulfill our lives, then that may also imply there could be a perceived lack to address what we're trying to address to fill a void. And if we're all aware of the universal concept of developing an abundant mindset versus scarcity mindset, then we need to go deeper than thinking positive alone. I know many of you are aware of this. Because sure, affirmations have their place, but we must first unpack our programming and examine our core beliefs to identify the root of the programming to understand how to course correct and before we can move to the solution or even thinking positive. Otherwise, we'll just continue to repeat those painful lessons and then skipping these key steps. So just as we wouldn't plant seeds before pulling weeds, right? We need to identify where the core issue is before we have the fertile ground. Then we can plant the seeds in soil ground after we have moved through each of these steps. So just think positive and the issue will disappear, unfortunately, is not the solution. And pretending to be okay or trying to be positive, maybe even when we've endured some traumatic experiences, which for those of us who have lost a loved one or sustained a traumatic injury, it isn't the solution and will only cause emotional repression. So we need to be present to the emotion to feel it and experience emotional freedom and then come to terms with the present reality first and foremost, so we can develop adaptive coping skills. We wouldn't plan a picnic when it's storming, so we'd have to accept the weather conditions and then find a way to work around it. And oftentimes confronting the pain might simply imply that we're being present to it, acknowledging the feeling or the emotion versus anesthetizing it by escaping to false comforts. And life can be demanding, which could prevent us from being able to address it fully or feeling the pain or lending us the adequate time and attention to acknowledge it. And when we haven't been granted that time or the proper conditions to do so, unfortunately, we have to redress it at a later time. And that's what this step is designed to help assist us with. So if we need a quick formula to help us identify the pattern or the limiting belief, then we can refer to a quick 3-step cognitive behavioral therapy formula to simplify. So you can ask yourself, what adversity are you experiencing? Which again, we're identifying the problem. What is the belief and the meaning assigned to your adversity? To locate any shame or judgment that might be holding us hostage. And then what is the consequence of this belief, such as the feeling or behavior? We can often examine the cost and the payoff. So if we use this 3-step formula, sometimes when we're in a hurry, it just helps us to gain that self-awareness and to be able to work through it with a quicker shortcut. But we're going to go through this with more breakdown questions. So let's address a step with some of these exercises and questions. Again, this is a good time to grab your notepad. And what are some of the emotions you're experiencing now in relation to your presenting problem? What we identified in our last workshop. And we're revisiting what meaning we have assigned to our presenting problem. And the reason why this question is so important is because feelings of shame or guilt will reinforce the problem and again, continue to cause us to stagnate or feel stuck. Therefore, continually repeating the problem or pattern instead of being able to advance to the next stage, which is what generally most of us want to do. So can you identify any judgments you have perceived from others, or more importantly, held toward yourself related to your challenge? So for instance, maybe if you feel like a failure because of, XYZ, right? If you feel unlovable, fill in the blank. This helps us to address the most important question to remove any feelings of shame. So who else must also be as big of a failure as you because they also suffer from the same pathetic and shameful circumstances? And I'm trying to use humor here because we often hold ourselves in such shame. And yet we recognize that maybe if you have anyone else in mind that you know of, that you admire, that's in a similar situation, whether it's related to poor health, maybe they've had some kind of disastrous relationship or finances and so forth. And can they be an example to you of accepting their condition versus resisting it? And hint, it is very common that once we can learn to love and accept something, that we can transform it. And in the proverbial sense, love does heal all things. So we may often learn to love ourselves more unconditionally, quirks and all, as famously expressed, are perfect imperfections. And that is the point after all, right? So how dare we encounter any challenge in our life? We're often learning to master something, be it success in our relationships or education, health, or finances. So it helps us to change our perception if we can look at how we can take it on like a challenge, maybe trying to make it fun, or maybe even like an adventure. And know that may not necessarily be easy, but it helps. So where is the resistance you're giving power to? Is the focus on the solution or the problem, such as the fear or the limiting belief in the problem? Our two primary motivators are to overcome pain or to experience joy. So we're either operating from fear of loss or potential gain. And in a simple phrase, see if you can name the fear that's related to your challenge. And you're also welcome to use the chat box anytime or write it down on your notepad. Sometimes if we can list the limiting belief or the fear, not only does it help us to remove some of the shame and energy around it, but it helps us to gain that much more clarity so that we do have the solutions and tools to move forward. And one question I think is by far the most important question that we can also ask ourselves is, if you were granted a second chance, what would you do differently through this learning opportunity? This is an opportunity to rewrite your ideal narrative. Go back to initial event or experience and see if you even would do anything different. Would you change anything? Did you handle it the way you were meant to and the best that you knew how? Chances are you did. Or there may be a different lesson you were meant to learn or develop. What would that be? And if you have the answer, write it down or share it in the chat box if you'd like. But if you're feeling any shame for not being where you want to be in your life, maybe afraid to fail, or even allowing fear to protect you from succeeding, then it could help to create a counterflip scenario, such as, what would happen if I did or didn't? And some examples could be, I can't afford to invest. So the alternative would be, can you afford not to invest? So in many cases, this also helps us shift the energy around it and using creative out-of-the-box thinking. So again, another example could be, if you don't like your job, would you prefer not to have a job that's paying your mortgage and helping you make a contribution to society? So it helps us to look at what value we're gaining from this challenge. So if you have any examples, such as I can't afford it versus what is the cost if you continue to put it off? Using these examples can help us work through the challenge. So when we can accept and come to terms with our conditions as a present reality for now and no longer resisting it from fear, it can help us allow ourselves to be a work in progress and to course correct with forward momentum. Because oftentimes we have the bigger vision and we expect ourselves to be right where the best outcome is, instead of allow ourselves to gradually progress to that outcome. So therefore, what is this experience, again, teaching you to accept altogether, whether it's to value something more? An example could be, losing my health has been teaching me to value my health. And once again, As soon as we can accept it, we can also transmute it. And in a world that tells us we're never good enough, how freeing can it be to choose both, to fiercely accept ourselves for who we are and continue to improve where we wish to? And then again, just to reiterate, one particular reason step 2 is the most fundamental step and most commonly missed is because we can develop a codependency in an attempt to turn to something external, which causes us to prolong the problem and recycle our patterns, repeating these lessons instead of transforming the conditions that we wish to change and advancing to the next stage of our life to achieve better outcomes. And unfortunately, healthy adaptive responses are not taught in mainstream society. In fact, it's quite the contrary, as we know. Therefore, as an alternative, missing this vital step will cause poor coping and escaping behaviors, whether it's to codependency, food, shopping, electronics, relationships, substances, perhaps an addiction to harmful medications or opioids, and causes fears to escalate, which breeds unhealthy relationships or lifestyles, and turning to those false comforts to, again, numb the pain or fill those voids, versus dissolving and finding freedom from these mental addictions, therefore no longer passing the burdens on to our offspring and future generations, which is just the subconscious programming, as we know, that is in our DNA. And because this is a common issue, we will see with our clients and with those who are not ready to make the necessary changes, it can appear frightening to confront. We know fear of change or uncertainty can seize us up with paralysis. However, remember to acknowledge yourself and your client for reaching this point on your journey, to address the pattern and make a commitment to see better results, because we never know what level of fear or trauma they are confronting or preventing any of us from moving forward. And just to lighten the mood, if you fear change, then go ahead and leave it here. All right, so what poor coping choices or behaviors do you recognize within yourself as a result of suppressed emotions, such as isolating or feeling withdrawn or using any of those escaping behaviors that we listed? Again, feel free to write it down or just internalize it, because we often turn to false comforts or seek validation when we default to maladaptive behaviors by shielding any feelings of shame. And we're human, we're not machines. So it implies that we're meant to experience all human emotions and feelings, which is in fact emotional freedom and mastery, not suppression or repression. Because feeling sad or disappointed is, well, part of the journey, unfortunately. And I don't make the rules. So we may all see the desire for external validation, and sometimes it's exhibited from others, or more predominantly in the younger generation, because of these growing social norms and behaviors to publicize our lives online, and the pressure to keep up those false pretenses or appearances to those around us. So let's glance at some of these examples, shall we? Can't we all appreciate a good selfie? Poor coping may include escaping to codependent behaviors by seeking external validation as a false sense of fulfillment or self-worth, such as those listed. So if you need help with this step, use this list of classic examples to determine if any may apply. So again, we may use money or financial status as a false sense of fulfillment or self-worth. Education, those who could be lifetime students because they're never smart enough, or identity attachment, such as to a career or an elite title, or families in politics, for instance. Image and appearances, often trying to keep up with appearances. Material possessions, status, such as relationship or job title. Codependency in a relationship. Shopping, right? We all love some retail therapy once in a while, but how about every day? And external stimulus, again, there's that social stimulation too. So this is a learned and conditioned behavior primarily from our childhood, and we've all been guilty of it to one extent or another, even if we've outgrown this propensity. However, we're biologically wired to desire the external approval, and this may be just a way that it is reflected. So what are the most common unhealthy emotional responses that you can identify with? Anger, blame, manipulation, justifying, or what we refer to as emotional reasoning, rationalizing, defending ourselves or even someone else, or even feeling like we need to explain ourselves. Running or avoiding, whether it's to escape or even becoming despondent. Withdrawing or isolating. Denial by dissociating, whether it's to something that feels easier, because dissociating is the most common form of coping with pain. So do you have a tendency to cope or respond to stress in a similar way as either of your parents or as the other primary caretakers? Pay attention and note whether or not you feel that you're behaving more like your mother or your father or however your caretaker was in a way that they responded to stress. Because again, this is learned. This is an epigenetic behavior from familiar patterns. So if you want, feel free to use the chat box if you have any questions or thoughts, or if you even want to share any comments. I'm happy to also pause if anyone has any thoughts or questions. Or if I'm going through any of this too fast, let me know. Okay, so now we're going to focus on adaptive responses by achieving acceptance, because it is a mindset. So when we can ask ourselves if we're willing to accept the problem for what it is, or at least make peace with the problem for the time being, we can no longer resist it. We can just come to a state of neutrality, and we're not resisting the fear, and by taking these appropriate steps to overcome it. So the goal is to reach a state of the neutrality by acknowledging the chief complaint to diffuse the emotional trigger. And we will work on perceptual reframing techniques to neutralize the emotional charge next week in step 3 of the PANACEA. Yay, something to look forward to. All right, so we briefly covered this question. Have you been able to recognize how your emotions have affected your behavior, decisions, or actions that may have added to the problem? And if so, how? This is a good time to list the costs of the problem or behavior. I think it's also helpful if we have a list and can find a way to identify these costs. We'll get to the payoffs later, but right now we just want to focus on where is this preventing us from being able to live our life more fully or live more congruent to our heart? And where do we feel like it has been somehow a burden to us? Okay, so what are you still struggling to accept about yourself that you attempt to perhaps hide from others? That's how to develop famous facades that we have, is when we feel like we're struggling to accept something, and then we develop these masks, right? These different facades. So in what ways do you mask your own true identity or flaws, whether they're shortcomings or other things that you don't like or accept about yourself? Because overcompensating behaviors may lead to us misrepresenting or over-exaggerating certain facts about ourselves. An example could be being in debt to appear affluent versus being in debt. Some of us may know others who are notorious for this. Now, we're not trying to pick on others. This is just helping us to collect some of the data so that we can work through this, right? So do you recognize any insecurity or propensity in either of your parents or caretakers? Again, not trying to pick on them, although awareness helps through these exercises by not necessarily advocating blame, but for educational purposes so that we can work through this with a little bit more information and connecting those dots. And what good are you resisting in your life? We've covered this with some of the costs. But if you're holding on to any rigid limiting beliefs that's associated to the presenting problem, what good are you resisting in your life? In other words, what is it you really want that you're not allowing yourself to have? So what's the payoff of holding on to these beliefs or behaviors? And what is your highest choice? Maybe you can remove the conflicting belief and you can have both, right? Whatever the example may be, the dream career and raise children. B, you can have the dream career and a good income. Whatever the case may be, it helps us to remove the conflicting belief, because we're generally operating from just being single-minded, right? From the analytical mind that's determining what we can and cannot do, when our heart is indicating what we want to do. So if we look at this objectively, we can determine a new approach and create more possible scenarios, whether it's work part-time on our dream career while our children are in school, etc. And it's that simple, right? All right, so try to see if you can find a way that you can marry the two together. If there's a conflicting belief, how can they both coexist? And if you can't come up with any new possibilities, that's okay. The idea is to at least identify what the highest choice and desire is. All right, and then next week, we're going to cover step 3 to neutralize emotional triggers with reframing techniques. So I want to take the rest of the time to conclude this presentation with our live Q&A.